How's it going, everybody? Welcome back to the hptuners live training sessions. My name is Alex Peitz of Peitz Performance Tunes. I'm going to be your instructor for today, and today we're going to discuss VVT tuning and more. And to help discuss that and put some of the theory we're going to discuss to practice, I've got this 2015 Ford Mustang GT on the dyno, strapped down, ready to go. To give you a little bit of background on this car, it actually has an intake manifold from a 2018 Ford Mustang and also retained the intake manifold runner controls, or CMCV, charge motion control valves. So pretty cool. You don't see that combination too often. Also, it has a complete exhaust on it. I have tuned this car previously, but we're going to actually try to gain more power through adjusting the intake valve and also the exhaust valve timing. So those two things combined, we're going to see if we can squeeze a little bit more power out of this combination. Other than that, you guys, please remember to pay close attention as we go through the class, because at the end of the class or towards the end, we're going to have a question, and whoever gets it right is going to win an MPVI 2.0. So that's going to be pretty awesome, and I really, really hope that you guys can, watch along and get some good info out of this, and hopefully, learn a thing or two, and let's have some fun. All right, so let's get going. All right, guys, now I'm here back in the 2015 Mustang, and we're going to get going and started on talking about today's topics. Before we get into actually tuning the car or making adjustments to the valve timing, I'm going to discuss some of the basic theory and principles behind valve timing and valve events and how that's actually going to affect how your vehicle is going to run. So without further ado, let's get right into it. First and foremost, we want to discuss valves and their purpose. So what is a valve? Some of you guys may already know. For some of you guys that don't know, a valve is essentially a doorway, which allows airflow in to the combustion chamber and also spent air fuel mixture out of the combustion chamber through the exhaust. So you have actually two different valves, and the sizing of these valves has a great impact on how your engine will operate as well. So the larger the intake valve, typically the more airflow you can get into the combustion chamber. However, the larger you go on the intake valve, the less room you have in the combustion chamber to be able to fit a large enough exhaust valve. Now, what's the best ratio? Well, typically your exhaust valve is always going to be smaller than the intake valve because we need to get as much fresh air charge into the combustion chamber as possible. If we don't do that, then there's no purpose in having a large exhaust valve, because if you can't get enough fresh air charge, air molecules into the combustion chamber, there's no point. So really, we want to focus heavily on the intake side, especially if we're going to be installing oversized valves. So that's really the main focus, especially on a naturally aspirated engine such as the 2015 Mustang we're sitting in right now. Now, the Mustang is pretty cool because it has 4 valves per cylinder. So you actually have 2 intake and 2 exhaust valves. So what that allows you to do is actually cover more surface area with 2 smaller valves versus having 1 larger intake valve. So 4 valves per cylinder is a pretty cool concept that actually started off with motorcycles and then was adopted into the automotive world later on. So that's really the main benefit to having a dual overhead a 4 valve per cylinder setup versus a 2 valve per cylinder setup. Now, some of the other combinations you may have seen out there are like the Triton, for example, which has 3 valves per cylinder. So there's some different combinations out there you may see, but ideally you're going to have 4 valves per cylinder, 2 intake and 2 exhaust. And of course, there's more exotic engine combinations out there, but for the purposes of today's class, we're not going to get into all the nitty gritty that you can see out there. Okay, so now I want you to consider this in terms of exhaust valve sizing. If you have a forced induction application, you don't have to worry so much about the intake side in that sense, because you now have forced induction, right? So that's literally means you have pressurized air coming into the cylinder. So you don't need to optimize the size of the intake valve because you've got help of boost, right? So because of that, you're going to have that much more fresh air charge coming into the cylinder. And the more fresh air charge you have coming into the cylinder, the more you have to evacuate that spent fuel air mixture or those inert gases out after the combustion process has occurred. So that's really where the exhaust side of it becomes super critical to proper engine operation and gaining the most power, being the most efficient, and also, emissions purposes as well. This can have an impact there. So when you have combinations such as the Coyote, where we can actually adjust our valve timing for the intake versus the exhaust independently, we can actually gain more power by making some adjustments, especially if you add forced induction. So that's something to consider as well. Now, we cannot change the duration, right? Which we're going to get into here in a second. We can't change the duration on the Coyote platform. However, we can change the time in which it opens and closes the intake valve, and the time in which it closes and opens the exhaust valve. So that's really critical. So that gets me into our next points. All right, so we have duration and we have lift, right? So the cam profile is what affects the duration, or is what determines the duration. So you guys may have seen a cam lobe, right? So that combined time of the bottom of the lobe and going to the tip of the lobe and to the other side of the lobe, that time is your duration. So once your cam is ground, you cannot change that, right? Now, you may have some radical profiles out there where it may switch to a different lobe for different scenarios or a variable valve lift, but we're not going to talk a whole lot about that. We're going to focus on the basics right now. So I don't want to confuse anybody or anything like that or get too in depth and then we lose sight of the main focus of this class. So duration is fixed. Lift is also fixed. And that lift, you have two different types of lift. You have total lift and you have valve lift. So I mentioned that the lobe. So the tip of the lobe, that is basically the point at which the valve is going to be opened the most, right? So that is your valve lift. Now that valve lift is actually multiplied by what's called a rocker ratio. So the rocker ratio times your valve lift equals total lift. So that's where you see, 600 thousandths lift or 620 thousandths lift, which is a pretty common lift value you'll see in LS applications. So the valve lift times the rocker ratio, which is typically like 1.7, 1.8, is going to give you your total valve lift. So that's kind of cool. That's kind of how that works. So if you guys ever thought about measuring that, you can actually measure your valve lift with a dial indicator. And so like old stock car guys, they would tell if they were cheating with a dial indicator and figure out the valve lift and the rocker ratio and determine if they got a different cam in there. So a little tidbit of history back there. But so kind of cool. But so yeah, so duration and lift are fixed with the cam. Now you have the Gen 5 Viper, which actually has a variable valve lift system. So it varies the lift based on other engine operation variables. So that's kind of cool, but that's not the norm, right? So once the cam is ground, duration, lift is fixed. Now you have intake duration, you have exhaust duration. The intake duration is going to vary or be different from exhaust duration, of course. Now you can have a split cam which has equal duration on the intake and the exhaust side. That is possible as well. But it just really comes down to what you've determined is ideal for your specific application. And I can't really tell you that because it varies so much with, okay, is it a manual? Is it an automatic? What gear ratios do you have in the transmission? What final drive ratio do you have in the differential? There's a lot of other variables. Is it forced induction? Is it naturally aspirated? So on and so forth. So that's going to vary, and that's going to dictate what your valve or what your cam is going to look like, right? So yeah, we have duration and lift. And also one other thing I want to say about duration and lift before we move on to lobe separation angle is if you look at two cams right next to beside each other, you could have a cam from company A and a cam from company B. They could have completely identical cam specs in terms of duration, in terms of valve lift, and actually operate completely different or make the car run completely different from one which would become from company A, and 2, which would become from company B. So that's something to consider. And where the magic happens is in the valve events. Valve events is critical, and that's when you go to spec a cam, you're typically going to determine your valve events, and that will dictate your overall duration and your lift. So that's really where it begins, is valve events. And that's intake valve opening, intake valve closing, exhaust valve opening, and exhaust valve closing. Those are your valve events, and those times are what are really critical to engine operation. Beyond that, just talking about lobe profiles, you have an actual ramp rate on the lobe. So basically, the rate at which the valve is opened and the valve is closed is also going to have a large impact on how the vehicle is going to run. So when we have an aggressive ramp rate, you can actually quote unquote cheat the duration and have smaller duration window, but have optimal lift for a longer period of time. So you'll see the lobe profile change towards the top of the lobe. So it may be more aggressive, be more vertical, and less diagonal, if you will. And so you'll see a more flattened, quote unquote, top portion of the lobe. That will basically keep you in your optimal lift range for a longer period of time. Now, there are some drawbacks to this. One being the fact that it's going to be much harder on your valve train. Your lifters are going to take a beating. Everything is going to be singing for mercy pretty much. So you have to be careful and determine, is that ideal for me? Because if it's a street driven application, typically you're going to see less aggressive ramp rates, and your profiles are going to be less aggressive because it's going to be easier on the valve train. You can run a typical hydraulic roller cam. You don't have to run solid roller. You don't have to run radical valve train components, different rockers, so on and so forth. So really for 90% of the people out there, you are going to want to go a little less aggressive in terms of ramp rate on the lobe. Now, when you're calling folks at Comp Cams, Crowder, whoever it may be, they're going to be able to help you out with that, right? Also, you've got a lot of shops out there that are specing their cams or determining what they want the valve events to be, and that coupled with their knowledge from, whoever it may be, the rep at Comp or whoever's doing the actual grinding of the cam is going to help you determine, the best route for you. So we also do have our own line of custom cams here at Peitz Performance as well that we do offer. I say custom, but there's a lot of talk about that, about custom cams, or is this off the shelf cam better? Well, I'll tell you what, the best custom cams become shelf cams, right? For a reason, because they work time and time and time again. So just because you don't have a custom cam doesn't mean that your cam is not ideal for your application. And honestly, it's more proven time and time again. So it may be better off, honestly, in the long run. So just keep that in mind when you guys are waging through the waters or wading through the waters of custom cam, shelf cam, this company A, this company B. There's a lot of information. There's a lot of misinformation out there. And I'm just trying to help you kind of guide your way through that. And then we'll talk about tuning, of course. All right. So lobe separation angle, or LSA. You may have seen that before. So typically, the wider the lobe separation angle, the less overlap you're going to have. So the less time in which the intake and exhaust valve are open at the same time. So the less overlap you have, the more cylinder pressure you're going to retain, essentially. You're going to bleed off less cylinder pressure out the exhaust, and that's typically going to help for low end performance, low end efficiency, and it's going to suffer a little bit on the top end typically. Now, obviously, there's exceptions to every rule, but primarily speaking, that's kind of how that works. Lobe separation angle is just that, the angle of separation between both lobes. So the wider it is, the more separation, the tighter it is, the less separation you have between essentially the tips of those two lobes. And typically, your more aggressive cams for more radical NA applications are going to have a tighter lobe separation angle just by default of how the cam and the valve events are spec'd for that specific cam. So just bear that in mind as well. So typically your forced induction applications are going to have a wider lobe separation angle. So that's just a lot of things to think about there. And we're going to throw a lot of information at you right now. So bear with me. If you have more questions, again, you can always contact me through my website or through email. So feel free. All right, so lobe separation angle, we'll talk more about that as we go, but that's just the basics. All right, so let's move on to the four strokes and how they relate to the valve events. So to help me describe this to you, I'm just going to pull back up the original slide, which I showed you guys when we talked about engine operation in theory. So we're going to pull that back up here. Okay. So this is the four-stroke cycle. We have intake, compression, combustion, exhaust. So when we talk about valve events, we are referencing our intake valve opening angle, intake valve closing angle, exhaust valve opening angle, and exhaust valve closing angle. Okay, so your intake valve opening angle, we'll start with that. That's referenced in degrees before top dead center. Now that's referenced in degrees before top dead center on the exhaust stroke. So let's forget about the intake stroke. Let's go to the exhaust stroke. So on the exhaust stroke, my exhaust valve is open already, and we'll come circle back to that. But at some point before top dead center, my intake valve will start to open. Now, if it opens after top dead center, then that's fine. You'll see it referenced in a negative value on your cam card. So if you look at any cam card, you're gonna see intake valve opening, intake valve closing, exhaust valve opening, exhaust valve closing. So typically it's gonna be a positive value. It's gonna be pretty small, within 0 to 5 degrees or so. Sometimes it could be negative. So it just really depends. But nonetheless, it's referenced in degrees before top dead center. So for the purposes of this demonstration, let's keep it simple. So let's say your intake valve is going to start opening 2 degrees before top dead center on the exhaust stroke, right? 1 second. Yes. Let me maximize this for you guys. That will work. All right, so maybe you guys can see this a little bit easier now. All right, so the piston is traveling back up to top dead center on the exhaust stroke. That intake valve opens, let's say 2 degrees before top dead center. And now there may be a period of time, a short period of time, but a period of time where the intake valve is open and the exhaust valve is about to close. So that period of time is referenced in degrees of rotational movement. And so let's say you have 10 degrees of time in which the intake valve and the exhaust valve are both open. So that is the amount of overlap you have in this particular camshaft. Now, the more overlap you have, the less cylinder pressure you're going to generate, or you're going to lose more cylinder pressure out. But that could also help with what's called scavenging. So if your exhaust valve is open at the same time that your intake valve is open, you are actually going to take advantage of the fact that the cylinder pressure is going out and you're seeing a more negative pressure, right? We'll call it that. And that's going to draw fresh air charge in more so than, let's say, if your exhaust valve was shut. So you're using that scavenging effect to draw in more fresh air charge, but then you're going to slam that exhaust valve shut. And then now you're trapping those fresh molecules, the fresh air charge into the combustion chamber. So now you're back into the intake stroke, excuse me. You're back into the intake stroke, and now the piston is traveling downward, so it's creating a negative pressure. It's drawing fresh air charge in, of course. We've got the exhaust valve shut, so now it's got nowhere to go. It's only to go inside the cylinder and get ready to have combustion occur. All right, so the piston is traveling down the hole again, and again, our intake valve is still opening, right? And so at some point, our intake valve is going to reach maximum lift, and that's going to be before bottom dead center. So roughly 90 degrees or so, I would say, give or take, that you're going to see maximum lift from the actual intake valve. So at some point, the piston will reach bottom dead center. The intake valve is still open. Okay, so this is one of the most critical valve events of them all. We've talked about intake valve opening. That was referenced in degrees before top dead center on the exhaust stroke. So now we're going to discuss intake valve closing. So at some point after bottom dead center, the intake valve will shut. That point is typically about 40 degrees, 35 to 45 degrees on most of your, I'm going to speak in LS terms here right now because that's what I know the most of in terms of valve events and that they work. But usually that these basic principles remain true amongst most of your engines you're going to see. So the later we shut the intake valve, the less, or excuse me, the later we shut the intake valve, the more cylinder pressure we're going to generate, right? So, but that could come at a price, though. So we have to be careful, right? Um, we're going to lose some cylinder pressure. It's gonna vary. Okay, so the later we shut it, the less cylinder pressure we're gonna have. Excuse me. All right, so now the intake valve has shut, and now we're traveling back up the hole, and both the intake and exhaust valves are closed. And so now we're starting to generate our cylinder pressure, right? And so you want to be sure that you know, obviously everything's going right. And at some point before top dead center, you're going to get combustion or you're going to get ignition occurring, right? So once ignition occurs, we're going to have combustion occur, and that is going to begin the combustion stroke. So the piston is going to travel back down the cylinder, and as the piston is traveling back down the cylinder, this is when the exhaust valve is going to start to open, right? So the exhaust valve opening angle is referenced in degrees before bottom dead center, right? And so the point at which the exhaust valve opens before bottom dead center is going to begin what's called your blowdown phase. We've discussed this before when we talked about it in class with our original class where we discussed engine operation. So the exhaust valve opening is going to start to relieve cylinder pressure, and after bottom dead center, you're going to gain, the piston is going to travel back up on the exhaust stroke. And at some point, you're going to reach maximum lift on the exhaust valve. And so once you're after maximum lift, and then we start to see we're getting closer and closer to top dead center on the exhaust stroke. And at some point, again, the intake valve is going to open up and the whole process is going to start back over. So that's in a nutshell kind of how that works. Excuse me, I had a little bit of a hiccup with my thinking. So the later that you close the intake valve, let's circle back here just real quick, just to make sure there's no, I want to clarify this. The later you close the intake valve, the more duration you're going to have. And basically, that's going to help, that's going to aid you in making more power on the top end, but it's going to affect your cylinder pressure on the low end because you have what's called dynamic compression, right? So the later that you close the intake valve, you may get what's called reversion. So that's going to actually, you're going to lose some of that air charge back through the intake manifold. So when you lose some of that air charge back through the intake manifold, you don't gain as much of your low end torque or low end efficiency. But if you have a car that's going to generate a lot of RPM, it's going to make a lot of power up top. It's got a really well-flowing set of cylinder heads. It's got a lot of cubic inch, whatever it may be, short stroke, large bore. You typically are going to close that intake valve later because you're accounting for the fact that you're going to have a lot of engine speed. And the faster we spin the engine, the later we need to close the intake valve to make sure we get optimal combustion on the back end. All right. So just to shore that up for you guys, I apologize about that. So again, intake valve opening before top dead center on the exhaust stroke. And then we have our intake valve closing after bottom dead center on the compression stroke. And during compression stroke, both intake and exhaust valves are shut. We're generating cylinder pressure. And at some point before top dead center, we get the firing of the spark plug. And then that begins our combustion stroke. And the piston's traveling back downward. We have gains of pressure. And at some point before bottom dead center, the exhaust valve is going to open. And then at some point before top dead center on the exhaust stroke, you're going to have your intake valve open. And after that, after top dead center on the exhaust stroke, your typically is when your exhaust valve will close. So that's in a nutshell how the valve events work. Now, hopefully that makes pretty good sense to you guys. I tried to generalize as much as I could. Of course, it's kind of difficult because it is a pretty complex topic. And I'm going to demonstrate more of how this works with the Mustang. So I think that'll make it more clear for you guys. Let's talk about one thing we didn't discuss really, and that's pumping losses. Okay, so that goes back to our exhaust valve opening angle and exhaust valve closing angle. So the earlier that we open the exhaust valve, the less pumping losses we will have because we're generating less cylinder pressure at that point. We're relieving the pressure sooner. So pumping losses is basically, a loss of power due to the fact that the piston is having to work harder against cylinder pressure. So if you relieve the cylinder pressure sooner, you have less pumping losses. Now, that could come at a cost, though, because you may lose some horsepower because you're letting go of that cylinder pressure too soon. So on the back end, when the exhaust valve is opening, we talked about the scavenging, you may not get as good of that scavenging effect because the more cylinder pressure you generate before the exhaust valve opens, the better scavenging effect you're going to get while it's open. And then when that intake valve opens, we can say, hey, we're getting a lot more fresh air charge. An analogy I used to teach some students back at another school I taught is, you're at a bar, right, and you got somebody. Yeah, never mind. I won't get into it. But you want to get the people that you don't want in the bar. You don't want them out, right? You don't want people drunkies hanging around there. But nonetheless, but guys, that's kind of how that works. Let's move forward here. All right. So valve events effect on engine operation and cylinder fill. We've basically been discussing that the entire time, and we could talk more about that later on. But I think we pretty well covered that. So I'm going to move forward. If you guys have questions, please let me know. So overlap or lack thereof. So again, we've discussed overlap and the lack thereof. Typically on your naturally aspirated cams and you're going for maximum effort, you're going to want more overlap, right? With your, that could come at a price for emissions, right? But as far as for your stock cars, you're typically going to have no overlap because you just want to generate as much efficiency and fuel efficiency, as much efficiency from the engine, and you're going to want to generate that low end grunt, that low end torque as much as possible. So like a truck cam that's designed for hauling, you know, hauling whatever it may be behind the truck, you want to generate as much low end torque as possible. So you're typically going to have less overlap in that particular application. So that's basically how that works. And overhead valve design. So your actual overhead valve versus overhead cam, here's the differences. So your overhead valve is like your typical pushrod engine. So your LS engine, your Hemi engine, Gen 3 Hemi, you've got the cam in the center of the engine, and you've got lifters, you've got push rods, you've got rockers, right? So that's an overhead valve because the valves are overhead. Now, in Coyote, like the car I'm sitting in, we have overhead cam. So we have intake cams and we have exhaust cams, right? So the huge benefit of this is the fact that we can adjust our intake cam independently from our exhaust cam, right? So that's huge. Now, some overhead cam applications still do not have independent cam timing for the intake versus the exhaust. So that's what twin independent variable cam timing is, Tyvek, right? So that's a huge technological leap for Ford in that aspect, but you also have other platforms such as Honda with VTEC that has a similar working solution for that as well, which has been around for many, many, many years, as you guys know. So there's that to consider as well. But any overhead cam is typically going to be better in terms of supporting more RPM and generating more power out of an NA application. Now, we all know that a pushrod engine is pretty awesome too, but the pushrod is going to generate typically more torque by the way of its design versus your overhead cam design, right? So there are some differences there. So you also could have a single overhead cam as opposed to a dual overhead cam. So a single overhead cam, kind of like your Trident, I believe, is going to be a little bit different because it's fixed timing still. So you can't change the intake and exhaust independently of each other. So there's something to consider with that as well. But dual overhead cam with twin independent variable cam timing is ideal for making power as well. Now, what's the downfall, you ask? Well, most of your dual overhead cam or overhead cam engines are larger. The design, the platform, the layout of them is larger. The footprint is larger. So they will not fit in different applications. That's why the LS is so popular, because it's tight, it's compact, it's light, and it fits in many different engine bays. So the Coyote, for example, is still a very popular swap, but not as popular because of the architecture, and the general layout of the engine, because you have dual overhead cam. But as long as you're designing the car around the engine, that's not a problem typically. But just things to consider, guys. Um, yeah, so fixed valve timing versus variable valve timing. Let's talk about that here in a sec. So fixed valve time is just that. It's fixed. You can't change it. Most of your pushrod engines pre-VVT technology were all fixed. Now, could you adjust it? Yes. But you had to actually get adjustable cam gears and adjust your valve timing based off of that. Now, if you had an engine dyno and you had the ability to do this, you could really see the effects on advancing the intake valve opening or closing the intake valve opening, or intake valve closing, doesn't matter, or advancing or retarding the intake valve opening, excuse me. So uh, when you advance the intake valve opening on a fixed timing application, you're also going to advance the intake valve closing. When you retard the intake valve opening, you also retard the intake valve closing. So you can't change that, right? Because that duration is not going to change because that's fixed, just like we discussed earlier in the class. So because that's fixed, there's really not a whole lot you can do about that other than changing the time in which it opens, and in conversely the time in which it closes. So with VVT, that's where it's pretty awesome because we can vary our valve timing based on load, based on RPM, and other scenarios too, like coolant temperature, intake air temperature, so on and so on and so forth. Like when you look at the Coyote, there's so many different options out there as far as, or reason or variables which cause the valve timing to change. So there's actually different, what's called different cam schedules as well. So let's just show you that real quick. So let's get out of the escape. Let's go here. All right. So I'm going to open up this tune file. All right, so here's the 2015 Ford Mustang GT. All right. Let's see here. All right. Here's the latest tune file. All right, so if we go to engine, we go to airflow, and we go to variable cam, you're going to see variable cam is enabled, and it's in twin independent variable cam timing, or TIVEC, however you want to say it. So these are basically the parameters which we're going to see, which are going to affect our cam schedule, our cam timing, depending on RPM, depending on load, mapped points, so on and so forth. There's a lot of different variables which affect what's going to happen here. So the first thing we're going to look at is our map points configuration, and we're going to see that 0 through 12 are enabled and 14 through 25 are enabled. So if it has a 0, that means that 13, 26, and optimum power are not enabled. So that's just a good way to know what tables you're actually going to be using or what map points are going to be active on this particular application. Now, EcoBoost, 6 cylinders applications, they're going to have different map points enabled. So that's going to be another factor as well. For example, the Gen 1 Coyote in a 2011 Mustang, for example, is going to have optimum power cam schedule active versus this one, optimum power map point active versus this one does not. It still has a cam schedule for optimum power, but it's just not going to use the OP mapped point. Instead, it's going to use a combination of different map points based on our valve timing at that point, or our cam position at that point. So for the purposes to keep this easy, we're just going to look at the optimum power cam schedule. So there's enable pedal positions for that. So this is set to 70% pedal. So 70% pedal and higher will actually enable optimum power cam schedule. This is our enable load. And so basically at 4,250 RPM, 91% load will enable optimum power cam schedule. So once it's enabled, it's going to disregard any of the other tables which you have under map points, under intake camshaft, whatever it may be. It's going to disregard this, and it's going to use this intake valve opening angle and the exhaust valve closing angle. So the intake valve opening angle looks like this, and we have our exhaust valve closing angle, which looks like this. All right. So as RPM increases, our desired intake valve opening angle is going to change, and our desired exhaust valve closing angle is also going to change. Now, Ford references intake valve opening angle versus intake valve closing. It doesn't really matter. It's kind of the same difference, right? Because our duration, again, is fixed. So that doesn't really matter. So when you get to looking at the intake valve opening angle, you may not know what this means, right? Because we have -20, we have -2, 4, and 12. So this is just a reference point from the base position of the intake cam. So if we see -20, that means that's intake cam is advanced 20 degrees from the base position. So that may be great for lower RPM to gain some low end efficiency potentially, depending on the application. But you don't want the intake valve opening angle too far advanced when we are trying to make power at higher RPM because we have more engine speed. So we need to compensate for that. So opening the intake valve later, right? So as you see in this particular application, as you get to higher RPM, we have positive values. So that is degrees retarded from the base position. So that means that we've retarded 12 degrees from the base position versus -20 means we're 20 degrees advanced from the base position. So if it were 0, it would be at its home base, right? Its home position. So just keep that in mind. And also that angle at which the cam is at its base position is referenced um, in the calibration as well. I believe it's right here at 340 degrees. But to keep it simple, we're not going to get into all that right now. So let's look at the exhaust valve closing angle. In this particular table, it pretty much is 8 and it becomes 15 degrees. So that's pretty ideal for a car that may have different exhaust on it, different exhaust modifications, because that goes back to pumping losses. Now, in a off-road application, if you have a set of long tube headers, for example, on a race car, you're going to want to retard the exhaust valve closing angle, right? Because you want to take advantage of that scavenging for as long as possible. The more efficient your exhaust is, the better you're going to get that high pressure out into a low pressure, because fluid flows from a higher pressure to a lower pressure. So we're taking advantage of those fluid dynamics, and we're going to use that scavenging to our advantage. So the later you close the exhaust valve, the more fresh air charge you're going to draw in by taking advantage of the scavenging effect. So when we have a race car, we have long tube headers, whatever it may be, we typically want to retard our exhaust valve closing angle. But this will vary depending on your application. For the intake valve opening angle, let's say we put a Whipple on this car, for example. Okay, I'm not going to want to retard my intake valve opening angle from the base position. I'm going to want to advance it, right? So the more I advance it, the more air charge I'm letting in. I'm taking advantage of that boost because we have positive pressure coming into the engine. So we want to advance our intake valve opening angle to take advantage of that, right? So that's really what we want to do in that particular application. So my values may end up at -15, -13 or so from say 3,000 RPM all the way to 8,000 RPM or whatever it may be. These coyotes can rev pretty high. So it just really depends on your application. So in a nutshell, that's kind of how that works. So that's VVT. That variable valve time is extremely helpful for not only making more power, making more efficiency, but also emissions, right? We no longer need EGR valves, right? Because with EGR, we can create a natural exhaust gas recirculation by affecting our cam position at lower RPM. So typically, you're going to see in some applications, they're going to retard the intake valve opening angle at lower loads and lower RPMs to create a natural EGR effect. So you're going to get some of those inert gases coming back in or staying inside the cylinder. So you have less unburnt gases essentially going out the exhaust, right? So that's in a nutshell how that EGR effect is working. So now we no longer need EGR valves. So that's pretty awesome because those were a pain, we all know. But nonetheless, we can affect our EGR, improve emissions, improve our clean air by adjusting our cam schedule. That's pretty cool. 20 years ago, people would be like, wow, like maybe 30 years ago now, the time gets away from me. So, but nonetheless, we live, what a great time we live in, guys. So, But all right, so let's move on. Considerations when choosing a camshaft. We've kind of been talking about this the whole time, but guys, just remember what you're doing with your car. It may seem awesome to have that big choppy cam, but there are downfalls. And I tell this to my customers all the time. Yes, it sounds cool. However, it's not going to drive like stock. As much as we can try to adjust the calibration and we can get darn close, I've got a lot of big cams out there driving like stock cars. Don't get me wrong. However, there are always going to be some fallbacks, some, you know, considerations you're going to have, and you're going to have to kind of be able to live with that. But a lot of guys, you typically don't want to go as big as possible because you're going to probably be let down, and it may not feel as peppy, may not feel as low and as torquey, right? So just bear that in mind when you're trying to choose the right camshaft for your application. Also, what you use the car for. Do you daily drive this thing at all? Do you drive it to work or whatever it may be? You probably don't want a big choppy cam because you're going to probably make your neighbors kind of upset when you're waking up in the morning and cold start's going to be pretty obnoxious. So just things to consider, guys. All right, so tuning considerations with a camshaft. One of the things you want to look at as a tuner is the cam card, right? Now, granted, the duration, knowing that's great, knowing the lift is great, but hopefully after discussing some of these cam or valve events, you guys may have a deeper understanding of maybe why that's important. So you're going to want to more so look at the valve events. So if you see intake valve closing angle of 50 degrees after bottom dead center, that's pretty aggressive, right? So because of that, you may see have a lot of issues getting that thing to idle because you're generating less cylinder pressure. Because the more duration you have, the later you close the intake valve, uh, the less vacuum you're going to generate at idle. So you're going to see vacuum drop dramatically. So if your vacuum drops dramatically, you have to advance timing. You have to open the throttle blade more to allow more air to come in to heat the idle at a proper setting, right? And then we start talking about some of the DI applications and being torque based, the torque calculation gets thrown way out of whack. The bigger the cam you go, the more torque calculation gets thrown out of whack. Now, that is also true in a Coyote, but you don't typically see guys putting big cams in Coyotes or cams at all because we have VVT and we can adjust independently intake valve and exhaust valve, right? Angles. So this is pretty much more for your overhead valve and your push rod engines, what you're going to be thinking about, right? So when your torque calculation is affected, you have to go back into those torque tables, which we discussed last time with the Z06, and we have to actually tell it that it's making less torque so it can actually give us the timing it needs. Because this is what happens. So you're generating less vacuum and you're making more cylinder pressure at lower RPM. So it thinks that the torque value is higher. And so it says, wait, you got a lot of torque going on. So instead of seeing like 50 pound-foot of torque at idle, now it's seeing 150 pound-foot of torque at idle. So it says, well, he doesn't need any more torque. We're making over our quota, right? We're capping this boy at 60 pound-foot and you're at 150. So we need to cut throttle, we need to cut spark, and try to control the amount of torque output from the engine. And that what happens is it idles poorly. It doesn't want to stay running. It dies. And so until you adjust those torque tables, which we talked about yesterday, or excuse me, last week or the week before, until you adjust those, you're going to have issues with the car running properly. So that's just all things to consider when you go into determining what can. Now, if you are thrown into this situation, excuse me, as a tuner, you have to know what you're up against. And reading that cam card, and especially looking at that intake valve closing point, is going to drastically affect how you're going to approach tuning that car, right? And also, it may be the fact that he may have the wrong cam altogether, right? You may look at this and say, well, this has more intake duration than exhaust, which may be a problem, especially on your LSs, because typically you're going to have more exhaust duration because you have smaller exhaust valves. That goes back to what we discussed with valve sizing, right? So just bear that in mind. So that could be a big red flag for you and say, hey, sir, I really want to give you some information about your cam that you have in here, and maybe let's consider putting a different camshaft in it. So it's just going to let you know what you're up against, right? So just consider that. when you go into tuning a vehicle with an aftermarket cam or when you're going to choose a cam for your car. All right, guys. So we've discussed some of the theory involved here. So let's now get into the actual tuning stuff, right? Let's have some fun. We're going to do some runs on the dyno with this car. Now, when I tuned this car previously, I didn't have a whole lot of time to adjust the valve timing. I didn't adjust the intake valve opening angle and exhaust valve closing angle much more than what I typically do on a combination like this. But I told him we are going to bring it back to do this class so we can see if we can squeeze a little bit more power out of it. Now, the original power this car made, let's pull that up real quick on the dyno screen. There's Jeff. So I believe our best time is here. Okay. Let me adjust the scale here a little bit for you guys. All right. Q&A. Oh, yep. Bear with me 1 second, guys. All right, guys, so here's the dyno screen. This is what we made in this car and the best pull. So I believe it was about, 371 horsepower and 329 pound-foot of torque. Now, I have a Mustang dyno, so it does read lower than some of your dyno jets out there. And this is SAE correction factor. Some dyno jets are in standard. And we're going to have a whole day where we're discussing a whole live training seminar on different dynos and how those affect how the car is going to read. So we will get more into that later. But for now, let's just keep it simple. We made 371 horsepower and 329 pound-foot of torque with this car last time we were here with it. Now, we want to do better. We always want to make more power. We always want to make more torque, but also we want to be safe about it, of course. So this is where we're at right now. This is going to serve as our baseline. Now, what we're going to be targeting here is generating more torque, right, at lower RPMs, and then we're going to start inching away at it as we go through the process. Okay, guys? So this is our baseline again. And so what we're going to do is going to use a procedure or a method, which I call bracketing the camshafts, right? So if we go back to our tune file and we go back to engine, go to airflow and variable cam, we are going to see again our optimum power cam schedule. So you have intake valve opening angle and you have exhaust valve closing angle, right? So right now we have a varying time in which the valve is opening and closing. So we're going to fix these values or bracket them for the intake valve and the exhaust valve, right? So for the purposes of showing you the effects of advancing the intake valve opening angle, we're going to set the entire thing from 2750 RPM and up to -20. So we're going to advance the intake cam 20 degrees from our base position. So highlight from 4750 and up and input -20 equals. So now we have fixed our cam angle at 20 degrees advanced from our base position. For the exhaust, we are actually probably going to keep it at 15. But one thing you want to make sure of that your scaling is the same from here to here, right? So let's just verify that. So if you guys didn't see what I did, I just left clicked on engine speed and that popped up our scale. So we're going to left click and drag from 1000 to 7200. We're going to copy that. We're going to open up our exhaust valve closing table. We're going to click on engine speed. We're going to left click, paste. and it's the same. So we're good. All right, so our scaling is the same. It's normalized the same, right? So from 2750 and up, we're going to put it to 15 degrees retarded from our base position. Again, positive values are in degrees retard and negative values are in degrees advanced, right? So there you have that. And now we can save this file. All right, so we saved the file. Now we want to flash to the car. So let's go ahead and turn the ignition on. All right, so to write the vehicle, we're going to click on Write Vehicle. Also, you can click on Flash and Write Vehicle, or Control W, I believe, as well. So now it's going to pop up. This is a Tri-Core 1791 engine control module. This is our operating system. This is our VIN. Obviously, you want to make sure that you're flashing the correct VIN and OS or operating system into the correct car that corresponds. So you want to make sure before you flash a car that you don't have any unnecessary electronics going. You don't want to have your cable or your laptop hooked up to the outlet or the cigarette lighter outlet and powering the laptop. You don't want to have that happening because that could cause other issues. So just be smart about this, guys. You know, make sure your lights are off, so on and so forth. So when we go to flash, we're just going to click right. All right. So now it's going through the process, downloading the bootloader. Now it's going to erase what's currently in it. Now it's important to note, we are doing a write calibration. We're not doing a write entire. So we're only writing a certain layer of the read-only memory to it. We're not rewriting the entire thing, so it does take less time. If you do a write entire, that can take more time, but you have to do a write entire. Let's say if you did an operating system upgrade or a OS mod, if you will. Let's like, for example, the S550 has an OS patch for the vehicle speed. Unless you apply the OS patch, you cannot go above 186 miles per hour. So this is especially frustrating if you're going to a Texas mile. We actually ran into this quite a few times. We didn't know how to get around it, but now, obviously, great folks at hptuners sorted that out for us, and we have the OS patch. So we can actually go above 186 when we're in safe scenarios, obviously not on the road, but at the racetrack. Texas Mile, for example, which is a lot of fun. If you guys haven't been to it, I definitely recommend it. So we got 10 seconds left here. All right, follow the prompts. 6. Okay. All right, so write completed. And now we are ready to start the car, and we are going to do our test. Yeah, you can go to the audio. The car audio is shut off right now. All right, guys, give me a second just to set everything up, and we'll be ready to rock and roll. Okay, so we're not going to do a pull all the way to, I think we did 7,000 before on this car. We're probably just going to do a pull to 6,000 because we have the intake valve opening angle so far advanced. We're going to really start to see power dramatically drop off after probably about 4,500 RPM or so. But hopefully before that, we pick up more torque and more power. So we're going to find out here pretty quick. Now we're going to go back to our scanner, our VCM scanner, so we can log all the data and you guys can follow along. So we want to go connect to the vehicle, where you have to make sure the car is running or the ignition is in the on position. We're going to go right here, connect the vehicle. Okay, and then we're ready. We're going to start scanning. All right, so you can actually see the cam position right here. You have VCT intake and VCT exhaust. So right now we're actually 20 degrees retarded from our base position at idle. Now remember, our settings will not take place until our VCT cam schedule goes to optimum power. Right now our cam schedule is not in optimum power. We're in optimal stability, which is indicated right here, VCT schedule mode. So in optimum stability at idle, it's commanding 20 degrees retarded from the base angle or base position on the intake cam. So just, you guys can watch that as we go through the pull. So we're going to go again to about 6,000 RPM from 3,000. So let's get going. All right, well, that was fun. All right, so let's see what we got, guys. All right, now we're back at the dyno screen. Now we can look right here. Now our baseline is the solid, and our current graph is the dashed. If you look dashed, we actually only gain torque up until about 3,800 RPM. So after about 3,800 RPM, right about 4,000 RPM, we actually started losing torque and also subsequently lost horsepower. As you watch it go through the RPM range, it actually loses more and more torque as you go through. Now, this is why we didn't do a pull all the way to 7,000, because you can see what's happening as we move along. The dashed line is substantially dropping and wasn't going to make any more power past 6,000 RPM. So had we kept going, you would have seen a loss of at least 100 horsepower or more. So this should really display the effects that we have of our intake cam adjustments and our exhaust cam adjustments. So again, as I described earlier, the earlier we close our intake valve or the earlier we open our intake valve, the less power we're going to generate on the top end, but we're going to generate more efficiency, more torque on the low end, as seen here in our test results. We gain more only up until 3,800 RPM, and after that, having our intake valve opening angle too far advanced, and also our intake valve closing angle too far advanced, or opening too soon after bottom dead center, we are seeing a dramatic loss of power. Now, this is why on especially naturally aspirated applications, we need to retard our intake valve opening or retard our intake valve closing angle as we go to higher RPM. And that's what we're about to do here, and we will show you the effects of doing so. So we're going to go back to the tune file, and we're going to show you what we're going to do next. So some of you guys may be wondering about the dip in the graph right after peak torque. This is a pretty stereotypical. It's a pretty typical thing you're going to see from coyotes. And the only way I've been able to really get rid of that dip is when I go to E85 and I can advance spark. It actually gets rid of a lot of that dip and it makes the torque curve more steady and more flat, which is what we're going for, of course. But that's just kind of a byproduct because if we put too much timing in at peak torque, we could see pre-ignition, right, or knock. And so we really are limited as how much time we put in on pump gas. But once we put E85 in and we can advance it, say another 4 to 6 degrees even sometimes, you'll see that dip start to go away because we can generate more cylinder pressure and it's going to overcome that effect that you're seeing right there. So hopefully that helps answer your question. So now we're back in the tune file, and we're going to go look at where we left off. So let's open up our intake valve opening angle first. Also, side note, we did do these pulls in third gear and not fourth gear. We do have a loaded dyno, so it really generates a lot of load and a very long pull if we do the pulls in fourth gear. This is an automatic, by the way. It's 6R80. It's not a manual transmission or MT82. So fourth gear is typically going to be your one-to-one. But on my dyno, I typically drop down one gear from one-to-one. It does affect power sometimes on some applications, but it's going to affect power more so if it's not a high power application. You're really loading the engine down heavily. It's going to make less power because it's just overloaded. So we're staying in third gear to alleviate some of those effects, just so you guys, in case you're wondering. All right. So we're only going to adjust one cam at a time. We're going to keep our exhaust valve closing angle at the same position, and we're going to actually go in and adjust our intake valve opening angle. All right, so we had a gain in torque, not much, but some gain up until about 3,800 RPM. Now you see here, it jumps from 3,250 to 4,250. So we may need to renormalize this to give ourselves a little bit more resolution in that range, but not necessarily, because it's going to kind of interpolate between those two values and it may work out for us. So let's not get too hung up on the nitty gritty right now. Let's try to keep it as simple as we can. So when I'm making my adjustments, I'm going to be retarding the intake valve opening angle. So I'm going to make that number less negative, if that makes sense. So the closer we get to zero, the less negative we are, the more retarded the intake valve opening angle is going to be. So from 4,250 RPM and up to 7,200 RPM, we're going to retard the intake valve opening angle by, let's go 4 degrees, right? So 4 plus 4, now we see negative 16. So we have just advanced our intake valve opening angle by 4 degrees. Now, we're going to try this first. We're going to do another pull right now, and we're going to see how it affects it. And we might have to expedite just a little bit for the sake of time, but nonetheless, you guys are getting the effect right here in the flesh, right? So let's save this tune file. Okay, ignition on. We're gonna go to right vehicle. And we're gonna flash. Hey guys, I just want to take a second and thank you for tuning in and watching along and following along. And I really hope you're gaining something from this. I really enjoy doing this for you guys, and I really hope that you enjoy watching. And it's only going to get better. You know, this is really a true treat for me to be able to share this stuff with you guys. It's really fun. And just let me know. I'm always open for feedback as well. We're all open for feedback. And so just let us know how we can assist. So we got about 30 seconds left, and we're going to do another poll. And hopefully we can start to see that torque still continue to rise as we retard our intake valve opening angle at higher RPM. So I can't wait. All right, 3 seconds. All right. So now we're gonna go back to the dyno screen real quick. Make sure that's set up. All right, we're gonna do another pull from 3,000 to 6,000 RPM and see where we're at. All right. All right, guys, let's get rocking. Wait for our widebands to come online here. There they are. All right, let's see what we got, guys. Let's go back to the dyno screen. All right. If you notice, this is where we actually adjusted from, was about 4,000 and up. The more solid line is our last line. All right, so to make it easier for you, let's get rid of our baseline for right now. And we'll reopen these all back up real quick. Bear with me. One second. I see what the problem was. We need to go back. We need to change the vehicle. Okay. My apologies, gentlemen and ladies. All right, so baseline. All right. So the solid was our previous pull where we had the intake valve opening angle fixed at -20 degrees. The dashed is our most recent pull where we actually retarded the intake valve opening angle 4 degrees from 4,000 RPM and up. You guys can see a direct correlation with our adjustments. Now, it didn't make much effect at 4,000. We saw a little bit of a gain after 4,000, but it pretty much went back in line with our previous run after that. So we may need to, retard the intake valve opening angle more after about 4,200 RPM or so to gain some more torque back. But if you look beyond that, from 4,700 RPM and up, we actually did see a little bit of a gain in torque. So I'd say probably 10 pound-foot at most. But we are seeing that we're going in the right direction. You guys are starting to see how retarding the intake valve opening angle is going to gain you torque as you see higher RPM. That is the purpose of this demonstration for you. All right, so let's go back and let's keep it going here, guys. All right. So let's go back to the tune file. All right, and let's open up our intake valve opening angle table and see if we can make some more adjustments. So go to intake valve opening, and we have -16 from 4,250 and down. Now, I'm going to go out on a limb, and I'm going to say that we can still retard at least 2 degrees everywhere, right? Because we still need to see more of a gain after 4,000 RPM. So we need to gain at least, or retard at least another 2 degrees across the whole board from 4250 and up. So +2, right? Now, so that retarded another 2 degrees. So let's go back to the dyno graph real quick to assess that. All right, so in the tune file, we adjusted from about this point and up. So we're going to hopefully gain a little bit more torque right here where we didn't see much of a gain on this most recent run. And then we're hoping to see even more gain through this range. Now, I'm going to get a little bit more aggressive. I'm going to retard the intake valve opening angle 2 more degrees from 4,700 or 4,500 and up, right? So go back to the tune file. I know I'm skipping around here. I apologize. So we're going to go from 4,700 and up, and we're going to retard another 2 degrees. And we are going to do another test and see where that gets us. Now, if it doesn't give us huge gains, I'm going to go a little bit more accelerated to try to get back to where we were at. So let's save this. All right. Now we're going to flash the vehicle. Interface not found responding. This is typically because we did not disconnect the scanner. So it's always important to disconnect the scanner before flashing, or else it's not going to communicate properly. Sorry, guys, this bug is just liking me tonight. A little Texas humidity, you know. Yeah, guys, I really appreciate it. Again, you guys viewing in. I think we just got another 50 viewers, so thank you so much for coming and joining us. This is pretty exciting for everybody. It's really exciting for me, so I hope you guys are enjoying it. Doing my best for you. So. And while we're flashing the car too, if you guys have questions, you can submit them, and they will let me know, and we'll try to answer what we can while we're going along here. So it kind of gives us a good opportunity to answer some questions. Also, we have people on standby to help answer your questions as well. So just bear that in mind. We're about ready for another pull, guys. It's pretty cool. Hopefully we gain some more torque, more horsepower. All right. So we're flashed. We're ready to rock and roll. We're going to get the dyno screen set up. All right. Fire in the hole. All right, so we're gonna give it a second to idle to get the widebands to come back online, and then we're gonna do another pull, and let's try to make some more power. All right, wide bands are working. We're ready to go and have some fun. There's a nice positive shift to it. It sounded better. Let's see what we got. Wow. Big gains on that one. It really, really, really likes the intake valve opening being retarded as we go higher RPM. And it's really cool to be able to show you guys this in real time and let you see the effects directly on the dyno. So that's pretty exciting. That just shows you the power of the tool too. I mean, it's really, I mean, you can't beat it, guys. So let's see where we're at in reference to our actual baseline as well. So unload. Baseline. All right, so if you look at where we're at in terms of our baseline, we're back where we were pretty much everywhere. We have gained a little bit of torque down low, 3,800 and below, which may help a little bit. I mean, granted, sometimes you're not going to see as big a gains. It really depends on the application and what combination you have. Now, again, this is an 18 intake manifold with IMRC on a 15 Mustang. So we may or may not see more gains than what we already had from my current cam settings I had in the car. So just bear that in mind, guys. All right, so let's compare with our last test we had. So we're gonna have to go back to me. So I saved it under my name. All right, so if you compare from our current run to our last run, we definitely pretty much picked up everywhere. Now, we're still not as high as we were originally with our baseline, but we're heading in the right direction. So it's possible that if we retard our intake valve opening angle a little bit more after 4,200 RPM, we may see more torque than what we had previously. So we'll try that out and see how it goes. But if we don't see a gain from that, we're going to really just focus our efforts at higher RPM from here on out. Because as you can see, we're neck and neck with our baseline power right at about 5,400 RPM. And after that, we start falling off. But that's where we start retarding the intake valve opening more and gain more power. So we'll do a little bit of both here. So bear with me, guys. So we're going to go back to the tune file. All right. We're going to go intake valve opening angle. And we're going to see where we can make some more power. So let's just reference one more time to the graph. After 4,200 RPM, again, we're going to try to retard the intake valve opening angle 2 more degrees, I'm going to say, and up. And then from about 5,500 RPM, we're going to retard it even more to try to get that power back and maybe make more power. All right, so 4,200 and up in RPM, we are going to retard 2 degrees. Okay, and now where we want to try to make more power, we're going to go back to the graph one more time. So again, that was about 5,400 RPM and up. We're going to retard more on our intake valve opening angle to try to gain more power back and maybe make more. So we have a little bit of a break between 4750 and 5750. So again, sometimes the normalization can affect your resolution you have in one range. So you can change that. Again, I'm going to try to keep it simple and not do that just to not murky the waters because we've already been using this normalization on the y-axis. So let's just go from 5750 and up. And let's retard another 2 degrees, right? And let's see what we get. But this time, I think we're going to try to do a pull to about 6,800 or so. So let's just go for sake of time. Let's retard more so from 6,250 and up. Right? Now we're going to see how this gets us, or where this gets us, and go from there. All right, we're going to go key on, or ignition on, excuse me, and we're going to flash. Right calibration. Click right. Okay, we also need the scanner. I do that all the time. I get too excited. You just have to disconnect the scanner when you're done before you go to write the vehicle. Otherwise, you get that error. It's just user error on my end. I just forget to disconnect the scanner when I'm done. Oh, so great question from one of you guys, one of our viewers. How are we disabling traction control for the dyno? So on the S550, there's actually an ABS fuse that I pull. There's multiple ways to do it on this particular application. However you can disable ABS is the best way. Now, if you hit the disable traction control button, it will work kind of, but you'll still feel the ABS pulse, the brakes with an S550. So that's why I take it a step further and I pull the ABS fuse, and it's just a 15 amp fuse, I think. So I pull that and then it's good to go. So other cars, you don't need to go that far. You don't even need to pull a fuse. Usually you just disable traction control, and after it sees the rear tires moving and not the front, after a given period of time, it just says, okay, ABS fault, and then let's go. So just depends on the application. Right. Ignition off. Back on. All right, let's see if we make some more power, guys. Yeah, we're gonna do a pull now to about 6,700 RPM. I go 68. Just waiting for the wide bands to come online. We'll be ready to go. All right, ready to go. Sounded good. All right, so didn't have any knock. And for you guys who are wondering, a negative value on knock retard on the Coyote actually means it's advancing timing. A positive value would indicate knock retard. So a negative value indicates knock advance. So the Coyote, another cool thing about the Coyote is they have both. For you guys that may do Subaru, you have dynamic advance multiplier. For example, that's the same kind of uh, system, if you will, right? So same control strategy in a sense. So everything's looking good in the data. Our fueling 0.83 lambda across the board, -4, -5% fuel trims. Can't really ask for much better than that. Our cam timing is definitely varying as we get to higher RPM. And now let's go to the dyno graph. All right, so we're gonna open up our last run. So we're gonna take some of this stuff off of here. All right. So that was our last pull. Second to last pull. And here's our last pull. All right, so you can see we actually lost a little bit down low. So we did adjust from 4250 and up. So we might want to go back and put our cam schedule, our intake valve opening angle from 4250 to about 5,000 RPM back to how we had it in the previous revision. However, we did pick up on the top end. So you can see actually right after 5,000 RPM, we'll say, we started seeing a gain in horsepower and a gain in torque, which is what we're going for, of course. And where that was falling off of 6,000, we continue to climb and make more power. And so we're really close to where our baseline was now, and we're going to try to see if we can exceed that. So let's get going on that. All right, so go back to the tune file. Now for a compare, I'm going to open up a comparison file from our previous revision to see where we were at up to 5,000 RPM, and we're going to put those settings back. All right, so to do that, go to compare, open compare file, and we're going to find bracket cam 3. So now you can see it's going to highlight green to indicate where we have differences. So our intake valve opening angle is where we made our changes. So to show compare, click on show compare, and from 4250 to 4750, we have -14 and -12. We now have -12 and -10. As we saw in the dyno, we did see a reduction in torque at that RPM range. So I'm going to put it back to how we had it in hopes that we gain some of that back on the next pull. So let's just highlight 4250, excuse me, 4250 to 4750, copy, paste, right? So now we've got that adjusted accordingly. Now we want to see if we can gain more power. So let's see what we can do. Let's go back to the dyno graph and let's compare with our baseline. So second test, unload. Baseline will be our last test. Sorry, it's a little bit confusing. Right? Now our second test will be the file from before last week. So we see now we're going to adjust that, so that shouldn't be a problem. And we're about the same from 4,700 to 5,600 or so. Now after that, the original baseline is still higher. So we know we have more work to do from 5,500 and up, basically, right? So we need to get going on that. So let's go back to our tune file. 5750 and up, we need to retard our intake valve opening angle even more yet, right? So for that, we're going to, let's say, retard 3 degrees, right? And take it one step further. Let's just keep it at that and see where we get it or where it goes. I can keep going for as long as we need to, but we're about done. Yep. Sir. Wow, you guys are really still tuning in. This is awesome. We're up another 50 viewers. Thank you so much, guys. Thank you so much. I just said that. But remember to subscribe to hptuners. Also, I have a YouTube channel, Alex Peitz. Also, I have Instagram at Peitz Performance. Of course, follow hptuners on Instagram. Like them on Facebook. We're gonna have continued content coming your guys' way. This is only just the beginning. We're only scratching the surface of all the tuning awesomeness that we want to discuss with you guys. So it's going to only get better, and I appreciate you guys being along for the ride. Yeah. Yeah. So, guys, just to kind of recap what we've been doing for you guys that may have just tuned in. So we basically started with bracketing the camshafts. We fixed the intake valve opening angle. We fixed the exhaust valve closing angle, and we're measuring our gains or losses from that. So we're essentially chasing the torque back as we go. So we're seeing where it's less than our baseline, and we're retarding the intake valve opening angle from that point and up. So we're watching as we go. We're chasing it back. We're trying to gain more power, more torque. But even if we get back to where we started, that's okay, because I wanted to get you guys familiarity with how this works. And this process will gain you power in certain applications. It just kind of depends. All right, so the flash is finished. We're going to do another pull, and we'll be about wrapped up here, guys. And then we'll do our Q&A so you guys can win that MPVI 2.0 with 2 credits. So that's coming up here real quick, guys. All right, just waiting for the white bands to come on, and we will get going on this. All right, let's see if we can get some horsepower and torque back out of this bad boy. All right, ready to go. We're looking pretty good. We're really close. Let's check out that dyno graph, all right? All right, let me clean this up a little bit. Let's just go from our last test to this test. All right, so we definitely picked up from 5,700 and up. And that's really where we made most of our adjustments. We're kind of teetering around the same range on the torque, but at the lower RPM. But we also have the effect of heat. We have more temperature as we do more pulls. So obviously that's going to be a factor as well. So I'm not super concerned about that. We're right around where we were anyways. A fluctuation of 5 to 10 pound-foot of torque is relatively normal. So nonetheless, you see the gains that we are seeing from 40 or 5,500 and up. Let's compare with our baseline now. the original test from last week. Okay, so we're getting closer, but we're still not quite there. So we're going to kind of do a Hail Mary here and see where we can get with it, because we're about wrapped up with time. And if we kept going, you would see the gains back. This is how the process works, and that's really the basis of what I wanted to show you guys. Obviously, I want to show you guys making more power, but if we don't get there tonight, that's okay. We just want you to see the effects of the intake valve opening angle being adjusted and the exhaust valve closing angle being adjusted, and inversely the others. All right, so we're going to try one more here from about, say, yep, about 5,500 and up. So we go back to our intake valve opening angle, 5750. We're going to retard another 3 degrees. Ask that again, sorry. Oh. Yeah, so there's a question for over retarding the exhaust valve timing. So yeah, so if you over retard the exhaust valve timing, meaning you're going to close the exhaust valve too late, you actually are going to lose some of the cylinder pressure that you would have. So if you, ideally, again, we want to take advantage of the scavenging effect of having the exhaust valve open, but if you have it open too long, you actually will lose some of that fresh air charge that you want to stay in the cylinder. You'll lose it out the exhaust. So you definitely don't want that. And so that's also kind of what can happen with too much overlap, the same type of effect you're going to see there. So you have to be careful with that. And so if we had more time, I would actually go back and adjust, keep our intake cam timing where it's at, and go to our exhaust cam timing. And we would try to advance it and then retard it back and see where it makes the most power there as well. So that is a great question, and I appreciate that. And I hope I was able to answer your question effectively. All right. So to recap again, we retarded the intake valve opening 3 more degrees and retarded an additional 3 degrees at higher RPM. So I know that it's going to want a little bit more than that. So we might just go ahead and go from 6250 and retard it another 2 degrees, right? And let's see where that gets us. I appreciate you guys' patience, by the way, because we are doing multiple revisions. It can get a little dry. So I'm trying to keep it as interesting as possible, and hopefully you guys are liking it. I did it again. Will he ever forget? Will he ever remember? I appreciate the feedback. It's just a built-in delay that they wait for the heater to heat up so much before it allows the wideband to output a signal to the ECU, basically. Press the exhaust. Say that one more time, sorry. Right. Yep. So you're asking about the over retarding the exhaust valve, because you may be compressing the exhaust gases as the piston comes back up on the exhaust stroke. So what you were referring to is what's called pumping losses. So we have discussed pumping losses earlier, and if you were around, but you may not have been, basically yes. So there's an ideal time to open the exhaust valve. If you open it too late, you're going to generate a lot of cylinder pressure. Excuse me one second. you're going to generate a lot of cylinder pressure, and that piston is going to have to fight that cylinder pressure on the exhaust stroke more so than if you open it up sooner. Now, the main factor here is going to be your exhaust efficiency. With higher exhaust efficiency, you can retard your exhaust valve opening angle and inversely your exhaust valve closing angle more so because you have really efficient exhaust. Now, you could change some other things. You could change your exhaust valve size, and you could also change the exhaust port. So this is where cylinder head porting comes into play, and where your actual cylinder head guy or your dude who's going to be doing the porting, he's going to take into account your combination. Is it supercharged? Is it NA? Is it turbo? Is it nitrous? And any type of forced induction application, you're going to make some other arrangements, so to speak, with the head design, with the port design, with the exhaust valve design to try to alleviate some of those pumping losses as much as you can, and also increasing the duration on the actual cam profile itself. So there's a lot of different factors that come into play when you're discussing over retarding the exhaust valve closing angle or exhaust valve opening angle. So you just have to take those things into account to determine what's going to be the best time for you. And of course, if you have a dyno, you can test these theories and see what actually works and what doesn't. Because theory on paper may not necessarily translate to more horsepower and more torque. It's just Alex Peitz, Alex and Peitz. So guys, my YouTube channel, in case you guys are wondering, is just Alex Peitz, and that's AlexPeitz. It's P as in Papa, E as in Echo, I as in India, T as in Tango, and Z as in Zulu. In case you didn't were wondering, I was in the military. I was in the Army for 6 years. So, but nonetheless, that's mine. Uh, Gotta get some more content out there. I've been so focused on this stuff. You know, I've got some good stuff planned for some other builds I've got going on in my shop. I think you'll really like it, the stuff I've got planned to put up on the channel. And it's just a matter of time before I get there. I'm just a super busy guy, of course. Just need faster editing as well. So, all right. So let's get these wide bands online, and then we'll get going. This will probably be our grand finale for our poll, or our hero poll, if you will. Let's see if we're heroes or if we're zeros here. We're all heroes, actually. I'm just kidding. Any day now. All right, here we go. All right, sounded pretty good. Let's see what we made, guys. All right, let me renormalize this a little bit. I think we might have actually picked up some power. And we were still climbing now. That's awesome. So we went to higher RPM, we could actually see more power yet. So let's compare with our baseline. Here we go. Yep, we gained power, guys. Not a whole lot, but as you can see, the trends were going up. We could have made even more power. So let's see here. So yeah, so peak-wise, 1 horsepower. Now, if I cut it off where you can actually see the difference, which is about 6,700 RPM. Let's go to that, 6,700. right. So yeah, we picked up about 5 horsepower on the top end, which anything in a 5 horsepower is 5 horsepower. 5 horsepower more than what you had before is a good thing, right? So that's definitely good. Now you guys may see, okay, we made less torque down low. What you could potentially try there is just copying your values from your your original file in there, and just testing if you still get back to the original torque value or if you don't. But that would be for another day. You guys have seen the effects. You've gotten the idea of how retarding or advancing the intake valve opening angle is going to affect how the engine is going to operate. You guys have, this is the tuning methodology, which is pretty widely accepted in our industry as to how to gain power using the twin independent variable cam timing system, or TIVEC, as I say it. So that's really the way you do it. So I really appreciate you guys tuning in and being attentive and asking questions. And the back and forth dynamic really helps a lot, helps other people learn. So thank you. Now to the grand finale, if you will, the moment we've all been waiting for. You are now going to be able to get a chance to win the MPVI 2 with 2 credits. So my question is, how is the intake valve closing angle referenced? Is it before or after bottom dead center, to make it a little bit easier? Again, I'll ask one more time. How is the intake valve closing angle referenced in terms of the piston position? Before or after bottom dead center? What's the name? All right, we have a winner. Madi Dogger, you are a winner tonight. Congratulations, you have won the MPVI 2 with 2 credits. Be sure to contact marketing at hptuners.com, and be sure to include your YouTube username so they can get you set up and get you your product, and you can start having some fun. Maybe you got a coyote and you can show us a thing or two one day. All right. So I really appreciate that. And for everybody else who didn't win today, you're going to have another chance. Every other Wednesday, we're logging in, we're doing our live training. Maybe me, maybe Tad, but either way, either of us are happy to help you guys out. And we hope to see you guys again. And of course, tell your friends. If you haven't already subscribed to HP Tuners, be sure to subscribe to HP Tuners YouTube page. Be sure to subscribe to my YouTube page if you can. That's going to be Alex Peitz. Like them on Facebook. Follow us on Instagram at Peitz Performance, at HP Tuners. And be sure to stay tuned.